All right, today we are doing section 5.8. It is very similar to what we were doing on Wednesday and Thursday last week with the factoring. Today we're going to factor trinomials with a negative constant. Before we do our warm-ups, quick reminder, what does it mean to factor? What did I say it meant to factor? Ellie? You're on the right track. You're thinking of how we figure out these problems. But if I'm telling you to factor something, what should your answer look like? Kian? We're going to write it as a... Daquan? Close. You're on the right track. When we distribute, what do? Multiply. So when we factor, we need to remember that that means to write it as a multiplication problem. I finished grading those quizzes. It was a little scary on some of the factoring ones. Our answers were not anywhere near being written as a multiplication problem. So if we see factor, that's what we got to do. Now, when we factor, we frequently use what symbols to show our multiplication?
Dots.
Not dots. We usually use parentheses on these. Okay, so you'll see parentheses set up a lot of the time for your answers to show your multiplication. All right, so for our warm-ups, we have two different factoring problems that we have seen before. The first one is the difference of two squares. So it looks a little bit different because we have a binomial instead of a trinomial. But there's something special about the first term and the second term of this binomial that lets us factor it anyway. They are both perfect squares. So when we factor this into our parentheses, how do I figure out what goes in the front of both of my parentheses? Kian? Not a GCF on this one. May? Close. You're on the right track. We don't divide it. The square root thing. So these are perfect squares. So to undo squaring, we have to square root. What is the square root of 100x squared? 10 and 10x. So the front of both of my parentheses need a 10x. How do I figure out what goes in the back of both of those? Square root what? 25. Square root 25. What's the square root of 25? 5. Who can tell me what my sign should be? 1 plus 1 minus. So we got to have 1 positive, 1 negative. That's how, if we were to multiply it out, the middle term would cancel and we're just left with two terms. One's got to be positive, one's got to be negative. Now that is something that we technically have already done and quizzed over, but it's still coming back. We're going to spend more time on those. It is another type of factoring. Number 2 is how we were factoring on Wednesday and Thursday. So before I set up my parentheses, what did I usually set up to figure out what goes in my parentheses? How did I show my work? So we usually just set up our magic X. Nothing terribly magical about it. What did I put in the top of my X? The 7. The constant goes in the top. So the constant's the number on the end that does not have a variable. What went in the bottom? 8. The coefficient from the middle term goes in the bottom. So I need two numbers that multiply to 7 and add up to 8. Thank you for raising your hand, Jay Sean. 1 and 7 is correct. So that means when we set up our parentheses, what goes in them? Kyan?
X plus 1 and the other one x plus 7.
Very good. So 1 and 7 were both positive, so x plus 1 and x plus 7. There is our answers for our warm-ups. All right, so here's our notes for today. We are going to be factoring trinomials whose quadratic coefficient is 1. Remember, the quadratic part is the x squared part. So we still just have a 1 in front of the x squared. And the constant is negative. So remember, the constant does not have what? You're on the right track. It is a term still, but what does it not have? How do we know that it's a constant? So if I were to put a trinomial up here, like x squared plus 8x plus 7 from the warm-ups, how did you know which one was the constant? It doesn't have a variable. It doesn't have to be on the end. We could rearrange it. But the constant has no variable. No variable for a constant. Okay, so today our constants are going to be negative instead of positive. We are still going to list the pairs of factors whose products equal the constant term C. That's the same thing that we would have done on Wednesday or Thursday. List the pairs of factors. Then we're going to find the pair of factors whose sum equals the coefficient of the middle term. That's also not any different from what we did on Wednesday and Thursday. We're still multiplying up to the constant, adding up to the coefficient in the middle. So that's why you'll see that magic X on your paper. It's the same magic X we were dealing with last week. The difference here is that if we are multiplying up to be a negative number, our constant is negative in the back. The only way we multiply to get a negative number is if what happens? One of our numbers has to be, they have to be opposites. One has to be positive and one has to be negative. So that's why it says down here at the bottom, one set of parentheses will have a minus sign and the other will be positive. So our general rules are going to be the same. These ones are just a little bit trickier because they have different signs. One positive, one negative. It shows sets of parentheses at the very bottom of your box. So if you want to put a plus in one of them and then a minus in the other one, that's fine. That's all they're saying. One of them is going to have a plus sign in the middle. The other would have a minus sign. It does not matter necessarily if you have the minus sign in the front or the plus sign in the back. What will matter is that you have the correct number with its sign. That'll make a little more sense when we do the problem. Okay, so let's factor x squared minus x minus 20. Now again, on these first few problems, they set up the table for us for our factors. What are we finding factors of? Not just 20 though. It's not a negative 20. So we're finding factors of negative 20. And then after we find those factors, what are we going to do with them? Add them up, which means we are finding the sum. Okay. So our factors of negative 20. Who can raise their hand and give me a pair of factors for negative 20? Jay Sean. Negative 1 times what? 20. Okay. How could I change the pair that Jay Sean gave me to come up with another pair? Make the 20 negative instead. So anytime somebody gives me one pair, I can flip-flop the signs to get another pair. Keon? Close. Negative 2 and what? What should go with my negative 2? A 10. And then what can I do with those signs? Flip them. So that could be another pair. Notice our list is a lot longer than when they have the same sign. Jamal? 4 times negative 5 or negative 4 times positive 5. So we can flip-flop the signs on all of those pairs. Any others? Nope, I think we got them all. So now we have to find the sum for all of those pairs. If I take negative 1 plus 20. Positive 19. What about 1 minus 20 or 1 plus negative 20? Negative 19. Notice, again, my number stayed the same, but my signs just flipped. What about negative 2 plus 10? 8. And what do you think the next one's going to be? A negative 8. All right, 4 plus negative 5 is negative 1. And what do you think the other one will be? A positive 1. Notice that your answer is positive when the bigger factor was positive. Your answer is negative when the bigger factor was negative. Okay, if you're not great with your addition of positives and negatives, just have your calculator handy and it'll make your life easier. Now, who thinks they know which pair we need? Natalie? 4 and negative 5. I would agree with that pair. Because my coefficient in the middle, they didn't write a number, but when they don't write a number, I know that it's a 1 and it was a minus sign, so the negative 1 matches. That's what I want my sum to be. Now, if we were instead filling in the x, which is what I anticipate we will be doing moving forward for the most part, I don't anticipate that you will show the whole table every single problem. What do you think I'm going to put in the top of my magic x? The negative 20. The constant still goes in the top. What about in the bottom? The negative 1. We don't usually write the x, but that's where it comes from, is that middle term with the x. So we're trying to multiply to negative 20 and add up to negative 1. We already found that the two numbers that do that are what? 4 and negative 5. Now, do we have questions about how we would show our work one way or the other? Somehow we got to show our work before we actually write our answer. Okay? Who thinks they can tell me the answer? Jaquan? Good. In parentheses, we would have x plus 4 because the 4 was positive. And in the other one, we would have x minus 5 because the 5 was negative. Now, I said earlier it doesn't really matter if you put the positive or the negative first. So what I meant by that was that you could write x minus 5 and x plus 4. Notice that even though I flip-flopped where the signs were, the numbers stayed with the right sign. So you have to make sure that the number stays with its correct sign, otherwise you're changing your answer. All right, next one. Again, we're going to go ahead and set up our big factor chart since they already put it there for us. Make sure you copy down the original problem so that you can refer back to it. On this one, we are finding factors of what? Negative 35. And we will also have to find their sums. So I've got my little table set up. We're going to go to the sticks on these ones. Kelby, can you give me a factor pair for negative 35? Negative 1 times 35 will work. Delaney's not here. Jaquan, can you give me another one? Good. We can flip-flop those signs. Positive 1 times negative 35. Jeriel, can you give me another factor pair, please?
Not really.
What else could we divide 35 by?
5 and negative 7.
I knew you could do it. 5 times negative 7 is another pair for us. Ellie, what's my last one? Good. Flip-flop the signs. Negative 5 and a positive 7. All right, we have to find their sums. Tariana, what's the sum of negative 1 and 35? 34. All right, we have to go to 1 and negative 35. Jakeem, what do you think that sum's going to be? Negative 34. The sign changes. All right, then we've got 5 and negative 7. Houston, what do you think that sum is? Negative 2. And our last sum. Keon, what's our last sum? 2. Positive 2. All right. Jalen, which pair do you think we want? Negative 7 and a positive 5, I agree. That gives us a negative 2, which matches what we see in the middle there. So if we were to set up the x instead, what's going at the top? Negative 35. The bottom is a negative 2. And we already figured out my numbers should be 5 and negative 7. Okay, this one went a little quicker than the first one. Not here. Natalie, can you tell me how I would use that to write an answer?
You would do W plus 5 and W minus 7.
Beautiful. W plus 5, W minus 7. Keep the correct sign with the correct number. If you would rather put your minus 7 in the front, you can. But the 7 has to be minus, the 5 has to be plus. All right. On this one, what are we finding factors of? Factors of negative 33. This list should be pretty short. It's not here. Jamaro, what's one thing I could put on my list? 1 and negative 33. Jamal Dixon, what else can I put on this list? Negative 1 and positive 33. May, what else can go on this list? 3 and negative 11. One more pair. Deja, what is it? Negative 3, positive 11. Now, we could find all of our sums, but does anybody think they know which sum we need first, Jaquan? One and negative 33. If we're at the very top of our list, that first one we listed off, if we find their sum, what is it? Negative 32. And that already matches, so do I need to bother with the rest of that list? Not really. If you can find it right away and fill it in, that's fine. So sometimes it just helps to have the list of factors written, and then it's easy to identify which one gives you the sum that you want. Questions, concerns about that? So we don't really even have to worry about filling in the rest of that list. We found the pair that we wanted right away. All right, so then we can also see what our x would look like. What number is going in the top of my x? negative 33 in the bottom, negative 32, and we figured out that the numbers that we want are 1 and negative 33. Then we just have to write that as our answer. Nevaeh, how would I use that to write my answer?
X plus 1 and x minus 33.
Beautiful. So we've got our answer. If you want to rearrange them, you can. Put the x minus 33 in the front, x plus 1 in the back. But you don't have to put both. You just have to have one of them. One or the other. All right, let's start going through these. Do I have any volunteers to set up my x for me on number 1? Ellie?
Negative 4 at the top, 3 at the bottom, and negative 1 on the side, and 4 on the other.
What goes on the sides? Sorry, I just didn't hear you.
Negative 1 and 4.
Negative 1, positive 4. Okay, so I agree with this x because negative 1 times 4 is negative 4. Negative 1 plus 4 is a positive 3. So if we use what Ellie put in her x to write an answer, what is that going to look like? Ellie, you just want to do the whole thing?
Yeah, x minus 1 and x plus 1.
Beautiful. Okay, now if you'd had to write out your pairs for negative 4, we'd have had negative 1 and 4, 1 and negative 4, 2 and negative 2. Now, there's not really a point in flip-flopping the signs on the 2 and the negative 2, right? It's really going to be the same thing either way, but if it makes you feel better to write it both ways, you can. So if that had been your method, you would have made that list, added them together, but right away we see that that first pair gave us that positive 3 from the middle. When we go to number 2, if we're setting up our magic X, who can tell me what should go in the top and in the bottom? Negative 5 and negative 3. So we're trying to multiply to a negative 5 and add up to a negative 3. So nothing's coming to mind right away, so we make our list. Who can tell me what goes on my list for my factors? Keon? So, negative 1 and 5, 1 and negative 5, whichever way you want to write it. I always like my smaller number to go on the left. Anything else that'll multiply up to 5? No. So then we check our sums. What's the sum of negative 1 and 5? 4. And what is the sum of 1 and negative 5? Negative 4. So if we put everything we possibly could on our list, none of our sums are what we wanted. We already talked about this a little bit. What are we going to call it? Prime. Now, we only write that when we've exhausted every possible option, which we already did. None of the factors' sums were what we wanted them to be. Are we ready to keep going? Okay. On number 3. This is another one that can get a little tricky because if we were to change this to a plus sign, it would make it a whole lot simpler for us. But it is a minus sign. So in our magic X, what's going on top and bottom? Negative 9 and negative 10. You might have been tempted by using 1 and 9, but let's just make our list and check them all out. If I'm making my list, what am I pairing up with 1? Negative 9. And I can flip-flop those signs. Negative 1, positive 9. What else can go on my list? 3 and negative 3. Again, you don't have to flip-flop that because it's the same two numbers, but if it makes you feel better to have them all in pairs, that's fine. Anything else that we could multiply together to give a 9?
No.
No. Okay, so we know we've got all the numbers we could possibly have. We now need to find their sums. 1 and negative 9. Negative 8, negative 1 and 9. Positive 8. What about 3 and negative 3? 0 for both of those. So we made our whole list. Are any of the sums what we wanted? No, so we say it is prime. Questions, concerns about the prime ones? Jakeem, you got any questions? Okay. On number 4, I need a new volunteer to set up my X. May? What'd you find for your sides? Beautiful. Okay, so negative 3 times 5 equals negative 15. Negative 3 plus 5 equals a positive 2. So, May, how did you write your answer? Beautiful. X minus 3, X plus 5. Questions, concerns? Anybody else get that one? Nobody else got it right? Oh, a couple people did. Okay. Did we get number 4 right? Oh, good. Okay. Number 5, I need a new volunteer to set up my X. Natalie?
Negative 2 on the top, negative 1 on the bottom, 1 and negative 2 on the side.
Okay, so if we multiply those, they multiply to negative 2. If we add them, the sum is negative 1. So I would agree that that completes my magic X. Natalie, how did you use that to make an answer? Good. X plus 1, X minus 2. Questions, concerns about number 5? Anybody else get that one? A couple people did. Ellie, is that a question?
So you even put X if it's a different variable?
Oh, no. I should have written S's. That's a beautiful question. Yeah, we should use the variable they gave us. I think I just autopiloted to the X's, but they should be S's. You are correct.
What? Does it matter?
Technically, yes. Even though we got all the knowledge down, we should be meticulous in our work. To be fully correct, we should have the right variable in there. All right, last one. Make sure we're using Y's. Who wants to help me out on the last one? Keon? So what's going in the top of my X? Negative 9 in the top. What's in the bottom? 8. And what's on the sides? Negative 9 and what? Oh, negative 1 and 9. Sorry, I can't hear all that well over here. And how did you use that to write an answer? Beautiful. We got the right variable in there this time. So we multiplied to negative 9, add up to a positive 8. Do we have questions before I put our homework up there? All right, our homework's on page 218, 2 through 24, evens.